Hey, Mafia boss satisfies a poor woman. Her new look with a luxury dress leaves everyone speechless. That is what they all said when they saw what happened that cold Tuesday morning in Brooklyn. Nobody could have predicted it. Nobody could have explained it. And to this day, the people who were there still talk about the moment a desperate woman walked into a world she did not belong to, and walked out transformed in a way that had nothing to do with the dress she was wearing. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand how it all started. Because this story is not about fashion, it is not about money. It is about what happens when two completely different worlds collide in the most unexpected way possible. And the truth behind it will leave you absolutely speechless. The wind cut through the streets of Flatbush like a blade that February morning, the kind of cold that does not just chill your skin, but settles into your bones and stays there, reminding you of every single thing in your life that is not going right. And for Margaret Holloway, standing at the corner of Church Avenue and East 21st Street at 6:45 in the morning, there were plenty of things not going right. Margaret was 53 years old, though she looked at least 10 years older. Life had not been kind to her, and her face showed every single day of struggle she had ever endured. Her hair, once a rich auburn that her late husband used to say reminded him of autumn in Vermont, was now mostly grey, pulled back in a loose bun that she had not bothered to fix properly that morning. Her coat, a faded navy blue thing she had found at a thrift store on Nostrand Avenue 3 winters ago, was missing 2 buttons and had a tear along the left pocket that she kept meaning to sew but never did. Her shoes were practical, worn, and had seen better decades. She stood at the bus stop, clutching a plastic bag that contained her work uniform, a ham sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil, and a small bottle of water. She worked as a janitor at a commercial building in downtown Brooklyn, a job she had held for 7 years, ever since her husband David passed away from a sudden heart attack and left her with nothing but a small apartment in a building that was slowly falling apart, and a stack of medical bills that seemed to grow taller every month, no matter how many payments she made. Margaret was not the kind of woman who complained. She had grown up in a small town in West Virginia, the daughter of a coal miner and a school teacher, and she had been taught from a very young age that you put your head down, you work hard, and you do not burden other people with your problems. So she did not talk about the fact that her landlord had been threatening eviction because she was 3 months behind on rent. She did not mention to her co-workers that most nights she ate rice and beans for dinner because that was all she could afford after paying for her medications. And she certainly did not tell anyone about the letter she had received last week from a collection agency, informing her that if she did not pay the remaining $12,000 of David's medical bills within 60 days, they would pursue legal action. She just kept going, one foot in front of the other, the same way she had been doing for the past 7 years. The bus was late that morning. It was always late on cold days, but today it was especially late, and Margaret stamped her feet on the sidewalk and blew into her cupped hands and tried not to think about how the cold was making her arthritis worse. She watched the people around her, the early morning crowd of Brooklyn, a mix of tired nurses coming off night shifts, construction workers heading to job sites, young professionals with their expensive headphones and their takeout coffees, all of them existing in their own worlds, all of them barely noticing the woman in the worn-out coat standing at the edge of the sidewalk. She was invisible. That was the thing about being a woman of her age and her circumstances. You become invisible. People look right through you as if you are not there. You are just part of the background like a fire hydrant or a mailbox, something that exists in the landscape but that nobody really sees. And Margaret had made peace with that, or at least she told herself she had. The bus finally arrived at 7:12, 27 minutes late. Margaret climbed aboard, swiped her Metro card, and made her way to the back, where she found a seat next to a window that was smudged with fingerprints and condensation. She sat down heavily, her knees protesting the movement, and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the streets of Brooklyn scroll past like a movie she had seen too many times. She thought about David. She thought about him a lot on cold mornings, because cold mornings were the time he used to make her coffee before she woke up. He would have the kitchen warm and the coffee ready, and he would say the same thing every single morning: "Rise and shine, Maggie, the world needs you today." She used to roll her eyes at that. She used to think it was corny and predictable, and she used to tell him so, and he would just smile that crooked smile of his and say, "Corny maybe, but true." She would give anything to hear him say that one more time. The bus lurched to a stop at Atlantic Avenue, and more people crowded on. Margaret clutched her plastic bag tighter and made herself smaller in her seat, a habit born of years of trying to take up as little space as possible. She watched a young mother struggle to fold a stroller while holding a toddler on her hip, and for a moment their eyes met. The young mother gave Margaret a tired smile, the universal smile of women who are carrying more than they should, and Margaret smiled back, and then the moment was gone and they were both invisible again. She arrived at her building at 7:45, 15 minutes later than usual. She walked around to the service entrance at the back because janitorial staff were not allowed to use the front door, and she changed into her uniform in the small utility closet that served as a break room for the cleaning crew. Her uniform was a grey polo shirt with the building management company's logo on the breast pocket and a pair of black pants that were slightly too big for her because she had lost weight over the past few months without trying to. She pinned her ID, badge to her chest, and grabbed her cart and started her shift. The building was a 22-story commercial tower that housed various businesses, from law firms to tech startups to a dental practice on the 4th floor. Margaret's territory was floors 15 through 22, the upper floors where the more prestigious tenants operated. She cleaned offices, vacuumed carpets, emptied trash cans, scrubbed bathrooms, and polished the elevator doors until they shone. She did her work, thoroughly and without complaint, and in 7 years she had never received a single reprimand. She was good at her job because she understood something fundamental about it. Cleaning was not just about removing dirt, it was about creating order. It was about taking spaces that had been disordered by the chaos of human activity and restoring them to a state of calm. There was a meditation in it, a rhythm, and on her best days, Margaret could lose herself in the work and forget, for a few hours, at least about everything else. But today was not one of her best days. Today, as she pushed her cart down the hallway of the 18th floor, her mind kept returning to the eviction notice taped to her apartment door when she got home last night. Not a threat anymore. An actual notice with a date and a court hearing number and language that made it very clear she had 30 days to pay what she owed, or she would be removed from the premises. 30 days. She had done the math in her head on the bus this morning. The same math she had done 100 times before, and the numbers did not work. They never worked. Her paycheck covered her medications and her Metro card and her food, barely, and there was nothing left over for the back rent, let alone the medical debt. She was going to lose her apartment. The thought sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. She had lived in that apartment for 23 years. She and David had moved in when they first came to Brooklyn, young and hopeful and completely ignorant of how expensive and unforgiving the city could be. They had made it their home. They had painted the walls and hung curtains and argued about where to put the couch and made love on the kitchen floor one night after too much wine and had laughed about it for years afterward. Every room held a memory. Every crack in the wall and stain on the carpet was a chapter of their life together. And now she was going to lose it. Margaret pushed her cart into the bathroom on the 18th floor and began to clean. She sprayed the mirrors and wiped them down with practiced strokes. She scrubbed the sinks and polished the faucets. She mopped the floor in long, even swipes, and she did not cry because Margaret Holloway did not cry. She had not cried when David died. She had not cried when the bills started coming. She had not cried when her older sister, the only family she had left, stopped returning her calls. She kept it all inside, locked up tight in a place where it could not escape, because she believed with absolute conviction that the moment she let herself break down was the moment she would never get back up again. She was mopping the floor near the bathroom entrance when it happened. She did not see the puddle of water that had pooled near the door, left by someone who had been careless with their hands. She stepped in it. Her worn shoe found no traction, and her foot went out from under her. She reached for something to grab, but there was nothing, and she fell. Hard. Her hip hit the tile floor first, sending a bolt of pain through her entire body, and then her shoulder, and then her head knocked against the base of the sink. and for a moment the world went white and silent, and she lay there on the cold, wet floor and could not move. When the world came back, it came back in waves of pain. Her hip was screaming, her shoulder throbbed, and there was a warm trickle running down the side of her face that she knew, without touching it, was from a cut on her forehead. She tried to get up and could not. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as a whisper, barely audible even to herself. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 10 minutes before the door opened, and a young man in a business suit walked in and saw her on the floor, and his face went through a rapid succession of emotions, from confusion to shock, to something that might have been concern but looked more like inconvenience. "Oh, are you okay?" he asked, not moving from the doorway. "I fell," Margaret said. "I cannot get up. Can you please help me?" The young man looked at her, and then he looked at his phone, and then he looked back at her, and Margaret could see him making a calculation in his head, the kind of calculation that she had seen people make 1,000 times before when confronted with someone else's problem, the calculation of how much of his time and energy this was going to cost, him versus how bad he would feel if he just walked away. Let me get someone," he said, and he turned and left. Margaret lay on the floor and waited. The cold from the tiles seeped into her body, and her hip continued to send sharp signals of pain up her spine, and she stared at the fluorescent lights above her and thought, "This is what it has come to. This is what my life looks like now. Lying on a bathroom floor in a building I clean, waiting for someone to care enough to help me up." It took another 15 minutes before anyone came. Her supervisor, a woman named Patricia who was competent but not warm, arrived with another janitor, and together they got Margaret to her feet and sat her down on a chair in the hallway. Patricia looked at the cut on Margaret's forehead and pursed her lips. "You need to fill out an incident report," Patricia said, "and you should probably go to urgent care and get that looked at." "I am fine," Margaret said, because that was what she always said. "You are not fine. You are bleeding from your head. Go to urgent care, bring me the paperwork, and we will figure out the rest. You are done for the day." Margaret wanted to argue. She could not afford to miss a day of work. Every hour she missed was money she did not have, but her hip was pulsing with a deep, persistent pain that told her something might be genuinely wrong, and the cut on her forehead was still seeping, and she knew Patricia was right. She changed back into her street clothes in the utility closet and walked slowly, painfully, to the service entrance. Every step sent a jolt through her hip, and she had to stop twice to lean against the wall and catch her breath. When she finally made it outside, the cold hit her like a wall, and she stood there for a moment, clutching her plastic bag, trying to figure out how she was going to get to urgent care when she could barely walk. She was standing there, at the back entrance of the building, in a narrow alley. That smelled like exhaust and garbage when a black car pulled up. Not just any black car, a Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the kind of car Margaret had only ever seen in movies. It was spotless, gleaming even in the grey winter light, and it moved through the alley with a quiet authority that made everything around it seem smaller and dirtier by comparison. It stopped about 20 feet from where Margaret was standing, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the rear door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders and an olive complexion and dark hair that was graying at the temples in a way that looked intentional, as if even his aging was something he had planned. He wore a charcoal overcoat that Margaret instinctively knew cost more than 3 months of her rent, and beneath it she could see the collar of a white shirt and the knot of a silk tie. His shoes were black leather, polished to a mirror finish, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never, not once in his entire life, had to worry about whether he could afford his next meal. He was reaching into the inside pocket of his coat, presumably for his phone, when he glanced up and saw Margaret. Their eyes met. And something happened in that moment that neither of them expected, because what the man saw was not just a woman in a worn coat with a cut on her forehead. He saw something else, something that hit him in a place he thought he had armored over a long time ago. He saw his mother. Not literally, of course. His mother had been dead for 26 years, but there was something in the way Margaret stood there, clutching her plastic bag, her shoulders hunched against the cold, her face lined with the evidence of a hard life that transported him back to a kitchen in Bensonhurst in 1987, where a woman in a faded house dress stood at the stove making pasta and trying to pretend she was not crying because the landlord had come again, demanding money they did not have. The man's name was Vincent Moretti. He was 61 years old, and he was, depending on who you asked, either a very successful businessman or one of the most powerful and feared figures in organized activities in the entire northeastern United States. The truth, as it usually is with men like Vincent, was somewhere in between. "You are hurt," he said. It was not a question. Margaret looked at him and then looked away, instinctively. She had lived in Brooklyn long enough to know that when a man steps out of a car like that, in an alley behind a building, you do not make eye contact and you do not engage. "I am fine," she said, and started to walk away. Or tried to, because the moment she put weight on her right leg, her hip seized and she stumbled, and she would have fallen again if a large hand had not caught her arm and steadied her. "You are not fine," Vincent said. His voice was firm but not unkind. "You have a cut on your head, and you cannot walk. Where are you going?" "Urgent care," Margaret said, not looking at him. "Which one?" "The one on Atlantic, I think." "You think?" "I do not exactly have a list of urgent care facilities memorized," she said, and there was a flash of something in her voice, a sharpness that surprised both of them. Margaret was not a sharp woman. She was a quiet woman, a patient woman, a woman who had spent her entire life smoothing over edges rather than creating them. But she was in pain, and she was tired, and she was about to lose her home, and a stranger was asking her obvious questions, and she did not have the energy to be polite about it. Vincent looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that would change both of their lives forever. "Get in the car," he said. Margaret stared at him. "Excuse me?" "The urgent care on Atlantic is a 30-minute walk. You cannot make it 30 feet. Get in the car, and I will have my driver take you." "I am not getting in a car with a stranger." "Fair enough." Vincent reached into his pocket and produced a business card. He held it out to her. "Vincent Moretti, Moretti Holdings. I have offices on the 20th floor of this building. You can look me up. I am not a stranger. I am a tenant in the building you clean." Margaret looked at the card but did not take it. "How do you know I clean this building?" "You are wearing an ID badge from the building management company. It is clipped to the inside of your coat." Margaret looked down. "He was right?" The badge was visible, poking out from between the lapels of her coat. She felt a flush of embarrassment, though she could not have said exactly why. "My name is Margaret," she said, because she did not know what else to say. "Margaret," Vincent repeated. "Get in the car, Margaret. It is too cold to argue in an alley." She did not get in the car. Not that day. Instead, she shook her head and said, "No, thank you," and limped away down the alley, and Vincent watched her go and felt something shift inside his chest, something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not pity exactly, though there was pity in it. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who is fighting a battle they cannot win, but who refuses to stop fighting anyway. He knew that look. He had seen it on his mother's face every day of his childhood. He got back in the car and sat in the back seat and stared at the leather headrest in front of him and did not say anything for a long time. "Everything okay, boss?" His driver, a thick-necked man named Tommy, asked from the front seat. "Yeah," Vincent said. "Everything is fine." But it was not fine. Something had been set in motion, and neither Margaret nor Vincent had any idea where it was going to lead. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we bring you real stories of unexpected encounters that change people's lives forever. You do not want to miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button right now. To understand what Vincent Moretti did next, you need to understand who Vincent Moretti was. And that story starts not in the gleaming offices of Moretti Holdings, but in a cramped apartment above a bakery in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, in the winter of 1969. Vincent was born on January 14th of that year, the second son of Salvatore and Rosa Moretti. Salvatore was a construction worker who did jobs for people who did not advertise their jobs in the newspaper, and Rosa was a seamstress who took in alterations from a small shop on 86th Street and who made the best Sunday gravy in the neighborhood, a fact that was acknowledged even by Mrs. Calabrese 3 doors down, who was generally acknowledged to be the best cook in Bensonhurst and who did not give out compliments easily. The Moretti family was not wealthy. They were not even comfortable. They existed in that grey zone that so many immigrant families knew intimately, the zone where you have enough to survive but not enough to feel safe, where every unexpected expense, a broken radiator, a trip to the doctor, a school fee nobody warned you about, could send the entire household into a spiral of anxiety and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Vincent's childhood was shaped by those whispered conversations. He would lie in bed at night, the blankets pulled up to his chin against the cold, because Salvatore kept the heat low to save money, and he would listen to his parents talking in the kitchen, his mother's voice soft and worried, his father's voice rough and frustrated, the same conversation over and over in different words, but always with the same meaning. We do not have enough. He remembers the shame. That is the thing people do not understand about growing up with very little. It is not the hunger or the cold or the hand-me-down clothes that stick with you. It is the shame, the feeling that you are less than, that you are a burden, that the world has looked at you and your family and decided that you are not worth investing in. Vincent's older brother, Anthony, dealt with this shame by becoming angry. He got into fights at school, ran with a rough crowd, and by the time he was 16, he was doing things that kept their mother up at night, praying to saints whose names Vincent could never remember. Anthony would eventually be caught up in events that led to his incarceration for 12 years, an outcome that broke Rosa's heart in a way that never fully healed. Vincent dealt with the shame differently. He became smart. Not book smart, though he was that too, but people smart. He learned to read rooms, to sense what people wanted before they said it, to position himself as useful to people who had power. He learned that in his world, the world of Bensonhurst in the 1970s and 1980s, power did not come from education or connections or family money. Power came from being willing to do what other people would not. By the time he was 20, Vincent was working for a man named Carmine DeLuca, who ran a network of businesses in South Brooklyn that were on paper perfectly legitimate. A waste management company, a construction firm, a linen supply service, but that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with anything taught in business school. Vincent started at the bottom, running errands, making deliveries, standing outside doors and making sure nobody came through them who was not supposed to. But Carmine noticed something about the young man from Bensonhurst. He was different from the others. He was calm where they were hot-headed. He was strategic where they were impulsive. And he had an ability that was rare in their world. He could talk to anyone. He could sit across a table from a union boss or a city councilman or a rival operator and make them feel like he was their friend, like he understood them, like they were making the right decision by working with him rather than against him. It was a gift, and Carmine was smart enough to recognize it and nurture it. Over the next 2 decades, Vincent rose through the ranks of Carmine's organization with a patience and deliberation that was almost unprecedented. He did not rush. He did not make dramatic moves. He simply made himself indispensable, one relationship at a time, one favor at a time, until the day came when Carmine, old and tired and facing health problems that no amount of money could fix, looked around at all the men who worked for him and said, "Vincent is the one." And that was that. By the time he was 50, Vincent Moretti controlled a business empire that stretched from Brooklyn to New Jersey to parts of Connecticut. Moretti Holdings was the legitimate face of it, a real estate development company with a portfolio of commercial and residential properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But everyone who mattered knew that the real business, the business that made Vincent one of the most powerful men in the city, operated in the spaces between the lines of the tax returns and the corporate filings. Vincent lived well. He had a penthouse in Manhattan, a house in the Hamptons, a condo in Miami that he rarely used. He wore custom suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and ate at restaurants where the menu did not have prices because if you had to ask, you could not afford it. He had a wife, Elena, a beautiful woman from an old Italian family in New Jersey, and they had been married for 28 years, though the marriage had become more of a partnership than a romance somewhere around year 15. They had 2 children, a son, Michael, who worked in the legitimate side of the business and who had his father's intelligence but not his ruthlessness, which Vincent considered both a blessing and a concern, and a daughter, Sophia, who was 24 and who had gone to Columbia University and then law school, and who currently worked at a non-profit in Manhattan that provided legal services to immigrants, a career choice that Vincent found simultaneously baffling and secretly admirable. Vincent's life was, by any external measure, extraordinary. He had everything: money, power, respect, fear, all the things that the boy in the cold apartment in Bensonhurst had dreamed about having. But here is the thing about Vincent Moretti that nobody knew, not his wife, not his children, not his closest associates, not the federal agents who had been building a case against him for the better part of a decade. He was empty. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Not in the way that crime figures are portrayed in movies, tormented by their sins and haunted by the faces of those they have wronged. Vincent's emptiness was quieter than that. It was the emptiness of a man who had spent his entire life accumulating things: power, money, influence, respect, fear, and who had woken up one morning and realized that none of it meant anything. That he could not point to a single thing in his life that had been created out of love rather than ambition, out of generosity rather than strategy. He thought about his mother. He thought about her more and more as he got older, as the distance between who he was and who she had hoped he would be grew wider and more unbridgeable. Rosa had died in 1998, and her last words to him, spoken in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and lilies, had been, "Be good, Vincent. Please. Just be good." He had held her hand and promised that he would, and they both knew it was a lie. So when Vincent Moretti stepped out of his Mercedes-Benz in that alley behind the commercial building in downtown Brooklyn and saw a woman with a cut on her forehead and pain in her eyes and a posture that said, "I am carrying more than I can hold," he did not see a stranger. He saw a debt he owed to a woman who had been dead for 26 years and who he had never been able to repay. The next morning, Vincent made a phone call. "Tommy," he said, "I need you to find something out for me." "Sure, boss, what do you need?" "That woman from the alley yesterday, the one who was hurt. She works in the building. I need to know her name, where she lives, what her situation is." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Tommy had worked for Vincent for 15 years and had learned to navigate his boss's moods and requests with the careful attention of a man defusing a bomb. This request was unusual. Vincent did not typically take an interest in building employees. "You got it, boss. Give me a day." It took Tommy less than that. By noon he had a full picture of Margaret Holloway's life, and it was not a pretty picture. Margaret Holloway, 53, widow, sole occupant of a one-bedroom apartment in Flatbush that she was about to be evicted from. Annual income from her janitorial job, $31,000 before taxes. Outstanding medical bills from her deceased husband, $12,400 and growing with interest. No savings, no retirement fund, no family support. Credit score in the low 500s. One emergency room visit in the past year for chest pains that turned out to be anxiety. One prescription for blood pressure medication that she sometimes skipped to save money. Tommy delivered this information to Vincent in the back seat of the Mercedes, parked outside a restaurant in Bay Ridge, where Vincent was scheduled to have lunch with a business associate. Vincent listened without interrupting. When Tommy was done, Vincent sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window at the grey Brooklyn street. $31,000 a year, he said finally. "Yeah, boss. And she owes $12,000 in medical debt. Give or take." Vincent rubbed his hand over his face. "My watch costs more than she makes in a year, Tommy." Tommy said nothing. He had learned that when Vincent made statements like that, he was not looking for a response. He was processing something internal, and the best thing to do was stay quiet and wait. "Set up a meeting," Vincent said. "Not at the building. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere she will not feel ambushed. What kind of meeting? I want to talk to her. That is all. I just want to talk. Tommy looked at his boss in the rearview mirror. In 15 years, he had seen Vincent negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. He had seen him stare down men who were twice his size and half as reasonable. He had seen him make decisions that would keep most people up at night and then sleep like a baby. But he had never seen him look the way he looked right now, like a man who had just remembered something he had spent a very long time trying to forget. I will set it up, Tommy said. It took 3 days to arrange the meeting, and it almost did not happen at all. Tommy approached Margaret at the bus stop on Church Avenue, which, in retrospect, was not the best idea. A large man in a dark suit approaching a woman at a bus stop at 7 in the morning tends to produce alarm rather than curiosity, and Margaret's first instinct was to back away and reach for her phone. "Ma'am, please, I'm not trying to scare you," Tommy said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "My name is Thomas. I work for Mr. Moretti. He is the gentleman who offered you a ride last week, the one with the business card." Margaret looked at him with the wary expression of someone who had lived in New York long enough to know that nothing good ever comes from a stranger who knows your bus schedule. "What does he want?" she asked. "He would like to have a conversation with you, that is all. A cup of coffee. Somewhere public, wherever you want." "Why?" Tommy paused. It was a fair question, and he did not have a good answer because Vincent had not given him one. "I think," Tommy said carefully, "he was concerned about you after he saw you that day. He wanted to make sure you were okay." "I am okay." "Yes, ma'am, but he would still like to talk." Margaret studied Tommy's face. She had spent 53 years reading people, and what she saw in this man's face was not deception. It was something closer to bewilderment, the look of a man who is carrying out instructions he does not entirely understand. "Where?" she said. "Anywhere you want." "The diner on Flatbush, the one near the park." "Name a time." "Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. And tell your Mr. Moretti that if he tries anything strange, I will scream so loud every cop in Brooklyn will come. Running?" Tommy smiled. It was the first genuine smile Margaret had seen on a large man's face in a very long time. "I will tell him exactly that," he said. Saturday morning came, and Margaret woke up at 6, 2 hours before she needed to. She lay in bed in her small apartment, listening to the sounds of the building waking up around her, the pipes groaning, a door slamming somewhere above her, the muffled sound of a television through the wall, and she wondered what on earth she was doing. She had looked up Vincent Moretti. Of course she had. She had gone to the public library on Eastern Parkway and used one of the computers, and she had typed his name into the search engine and spent an hour reading. What she found was a man who existed in 2 worlds simultaneously. In one world, he was a successful real estate developer, a philanthropist who donated to children's hospitals and arts programs, a respected member of the business community. In the other world, he was whispered about in a very different way. There were articles not in the major newspapers, those were careful about what they printed, but in smaller outlets and blogs that connected his name to organizations and activities that Margaret had only ever seen depicted in movies. She should cancel. That was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. She should call Tommy or just not show up and go back to her life of early buses and mopped floors and rice and beans for dinner. But she did not cancel. And the reason she did not cancel was something she could not fully explain even to herself. It was not curiosity exactly. It was not desperation, though desperation was certainly part of it. It was something more fundamental than either of those things. It was the fact that in that alley, on the worst day of a series of increasingly bad days, a man had looked at her and seen her. Not looked through her, not looked past her, seen her, and that had not happened in a very long time. She put on the best clothes she owned, a pair of black pants that were only slightly faded, and a blue blouse that she had bought 3 years ago for David's memorial and had not worn since. She brushed her hair and put on a touch of lipstick, the last remnant of a tube she had been nursing for over a year, and she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and tried to see what Vincent Moretti had seen. She could not see it. All she saw was a tired woman in borrowed time. The diner was called the Flatbush Grill, and it was exactly the kind of place Margaret felt comfortable in. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that came in thick white mugs and was always slightly too hot and slightly too strong. She arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes early, because she was always early for everything, and she chose a booth near the back where she could see the door. Vincent walked in at exactly 9 o'clock. He was wearing casual clothes, or what passed for casual in his world, dark jeans, a black sweater, a leather jacket. Without the overcoat and the suit, he looked less intimidating but no less substantial. He moved through the diner with the ease of a man who was comfortable anywhere, nodding to the waitress as he passed, scanning the room with eyes that missed nothing. He spotted Margaret and walked to her booth and stood there for a moment looking down at her. "Margaret," he said, "Mr. Moretti." "Vincent, please." He sat down across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other, two people from completely different worlds separated by a Formica tabletop and about $50 million. "How is your head?" he asked. "It is fine. 7 stitches. Nothing major." "And your hip?" Margaret was surprised. "How do you know about my hip?" "You were limping badly when I saw you. That is not a head injury." "Bruised. Nothing broken. I went back to work the next day." Vincent nodded slowly. The waitress came by, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, and they ordered coffee, both black, and there was a brief awkward silence while the coffee was poured and the waitress retreated. "You are wondering why I asked to see you," Vincent said. "The thought has crossed my mind. I am going to be honest with you, Margaret, because I think you are the kind of person who can spot dishonesty a mile away. I saw you in that alley and something hit me. I do not know how to describe it except to say that you reminded me of someone important, and I went home that night and I could not stop thinking about it." "Who did I remind you of?" "My mother." Margaret blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not one of them. "Your mother," she repeated. "Rosa. She died in 1998. But before that, before she died, she spent her entire life doing what you are doing, working herself to exhaustion for money that was never enough, carrying the weight of a family on her shoulders without ever complaining, making herself invisible so that everyone else could be seen." He paused. He picked up his coffee mug and held it in both hands but did not drink from it. "I was not a good son to her," he said. "I gave her money, yes. I bought her a nice apartment. I made sure she had everything she needed. But I did not give her the thing she wanted most, which was for me to be a different man, a better man. And by the time I understood that, she was gone." Margaret said nothing. She waited. "I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me," Vincent continued. "I am telling you because I want you to understand why I am sitting here. I cannot go back and help my mother. But I saw you in that alley, and I thought, maybe I can help her." "I do not need help," Margaret said automatically. It was reflex, muscle memory. The words came out before she could stop them, the same words she had been saying to everyone, including herself, for 7 years. Vincent looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Margaret," he said gently, "you are about to be evicted. You owe $12,000 in medical bills. You skip your blood pressure medication to save money. You eat rice and beans for dinner every night because you cannot afford anything else. You fell at work and you could barely walk and you went back the next day because you cannot afford to miss a single shift." Margaret's face went pale. "How do you know all that?" "Because I asked someone to find out. And before you get angry about that, understand this. I'm not here to invade your privacy. I'm here because I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and you do not have enough to keep a roof over your head, and that is a situation I can fix, easily, without it costing me anything that I will ever miss. I am not a charity case. No, you are not. You are a woman who works harder than 99% of the people I know, and who has been dealt a hand that nobody deserves, and who is too proud to ask for help even when she is drowning. That is not a charity case. That is someone who deserves a break." Margaret looked down at her coffee. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she pressed them flat against the table to make them stop. She could feel something rising in her chest, something she had spent 7 years holding down, and she was terrified that if she opened her mouth, it would come flooding out. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm going to pay off your medical bills. I'm going to pay your back rent and set up a fund that covers your rent for the next 5 years. I am going to get you proper health insurance so you never have to skip your medication again. And I am going to do something else, something that might sound strange, but I need you to hear me out. Margaret looked up. What? There is an event this Friday. A charity gala at the Waldorf. Very fancy. Very important people. The kind of people who never look at. People like you and me, or at least not you. They have to look at me because I write checks, but the point is, I want you to come. To a charity gala. Yes. At the Waldorf. Yes. Margaret almost laughed. Almost. Mr. Moretti. Vincent. Vincent. I clean bathrooms for a living. I do not go to galas. I know. That is exactly why I want you there. Margaret said no. She said no clearly and firmly, and without hesitation. And then she said no again, when Vincent asked her to think about it. And then she said no a third time when he said he would not push. But could she at least not make a final decision until she had thought about it for 24 hours? I have thought about it, she said. The answer is no. She walked out of the diner that morning with her head high and her jaw set, and her mind made up. She walked to the bus stop and waited in the cold and rode the bus to her apartment and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, wincing at the pain in her hip. And she unlocked her door and stood in the middle of her small living room and looked around at the life she had built and was about to lose. The eviction notice was on the kitchen table where she had left it. The letter from the collection agency was next to it. On the counter next to the stove was a bottle of blood pressure medication that was almost empty and that she could not afford to refill. She thought about what Vincent had said. She thought about it all afternoon and all evening and, well into the night, lying in the dark in her bed, listening to the city breathe outside her window, and she tried to find a reason to say yes that was not pride-swallowing and dignity-compromising and everything she had been taught not to be. She could not find one. But she could not find a reason to keep saying no either, because the truth, the ugly, unvarnished truth, was that she was drowning. She had been drowning for 7 years, and no amount of hard work or quiet dignity or bootstrap pulling was going to save her. The math did not work, it had never worked, and continuing to pretend that it would was not strength. It was denial. She called Tommy at 6 the next morning. She had kept the business card he had given her, tucked into the pocket of her coat. "Tell your Mr. Moretti," she said, "that I will think about the gala, but I am not promising anything." Tommy relayed the message. Vincent smiled when he heard it, the first real smile Tommy had seen on his face in months. "Set it up," Vincent said. "All of it. The bills, the rent, the insurance. Do it today. And call Francesca." Francesca? Francesca DiBiase, the stylist. "Tell her I have a project for her." Francesca DiBiase was a woman who existed at the intersection of fashion, psychology, and alchemy. She was 58 years old, Milanese by birth, and she had been a personal stylist for 30 years, serving clients who ranged from movie stars to politicians to the wives of men like Vincent Moretti. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with sharp eyes behind elegant glasses, and a way of looking at people that made them feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. She arrived at Margaret's apartment on Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before the gala, in a town car that looked wildly out of place on Margaret's block. She came with Tommy, who stood awkwardly in the hallway, while Francesca swept into the apartment with the energy of a small, well-dressed hurricane. Margaret had been warned. She was coming, but she was still not prepared. She stood in her living room in her work clothes, feeling like a trespasser in her own home, while Francesca walked around her in slow circles, examining her from every angle with an expression of intense concentration. "Stop looking at me like that," Margaret said. "Like what?" Francesca asked, her Italian accent softening the edges of her words. Like I am a problem that needs solving. Francesca stopped walking and looked Margaret directly in the eyes. She was silent for a moment, and then she said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. Margaret, she said, I have dressed some of the most beautiful women in the world. Women with perfect bodies and unlimited budgets and access to every designer on the planet. And you know what most of them have in common? They are terrified. They are terrified that without the dress, without the shoes, without the jewelry, they are nothing. That all anyone sees when they look at them is the packaging. She took a step closer. You are the opposite of those women. You have spent your entire life being seen for nothing but who you are. No packaging, no camouflage, just you, raw and unadorned, facing the world with nothing but your own strength. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how powerful that is? Margaret swallowed. I do not feel powerful. I know. And that is the problem I am going to solve. Not by turning you into someone else. Not by hiding you behind a dress. But by giving you a way to show the world what I can already see. What Vincent can already see, the woman you actually are. Over the next 3 days, Francesca worked. She did not just pick out a dress, she created an experience. She started by spending an entire afternoon talking to Margaret, not about sizes or colors or styles, but about her life, about David, about West Virginia, about what it felt like to clean floors in a building where nobody knew her name, about the things that made her laugh, and the things that made her proud, and the things that kept her awake at night. And from those conversations, Francesca built a vision. The dress she chose was not the most expensive option. It was not the flashiest or the most fashionable. It was an emerald green gown by a designer Margaret had never heard of, made of silk that felt like water when you touched it, with a neckline that was elegant without being revealing, and a cut that moved with the body rather than constraining it. The color was deliberate. Francesca had noticed that Margaret's eyes, which were a soft hazel, came alive against green, and that the color brought out a warmth in her skin that was hidden by the gray and navy she usually wore. Why green? Margaret asked when she saw it. Because green is the color of growing things, Francesca said, and that is what you are doing. Growing. The shoes were simple, black heels, not too high, comfortable enough to stand in for hours. Francesca was pragmatic about shoes. A woman who cannot walk is a woman who cannot command a room, she said, and you, Margaret, are going to command that room. The jewelry was borrowed, a simple pendant necklace with a single stone that caught the light when Margaret moved, and small earrings that complemented her face without overwhelming it. Francesca did Margaret's hair herself, washing it and cutting it and styling it in a way that somehow made Margaret look both younger and more distinguished, a soft wave that framed her face and exposed the lines of her neck and jaw. The makeup was minimal, a touch of foundation to even out her skin, a hint of color on her cheeks, her eyes defined but not masked. Francesca did not believe in makeup as disguise. She believed in makeup as emphasis. I want people to see your face, she said, gently blending color along Margaret's cheekbone. Not a mask. Margaret sat in a chair in her living room while Francesca worked on her, and she felt like a woman, in a dream. Not because of the dress or the jewelry or the makeup, but because of the attention, because someone was looking at her, really looking at her, and taking time with her, and telling her that she mattered. When was the last time anyone had done that? She could not remember. On Friday afternoon, the day of the gala, Francesca brought everything to Margaret's apartment for the final preparations. She arrived at 3 o'clock, 5 hours before the event, with garment bags and makeup, kits and shoes in boxes, and the pendant necklace in a velvet pouch. Margaret had taken the day off work, the first day she had taken off voluntarily in over 3 years, and she had spent the morning cleaning her apartment, which was already clean, because cleaning was what she did when she was nervous. Francesca helped her dress, adjusting the gown, pinning a fold here, smoothing a seam there. She did Margaret's hair, working with practiced hands that moved with the confidence of decades of experience. She applied the makeup slowly, carefully, talking softly as she worked, telling stories about Milan and about the first time she had dressed a nervous woman for a party, and about how every woman, every single woman, no matter how confident she appears, feels exactly the way Margaret was feeling right now. At 6:30, Francesca stepped back and looked at Margaret and smiled. "Go look," she said, gesturing toward the bathroom mirror. Margaret walked to the bathroom. Her hip ached, the way it always ached now, but she barely noticed. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself, and she did not recognize the woman looking back. No, that is not right. She recognized her. That was the thing. She recognized her immediately. The woman in the mirror was Margaret Holloway, the girl from West Virginia, the wife who made David laugh every day, the mother figure to every young person she had ever mentored at church, the woman who could clean a bathroom until it sparkled, and cook a pot roast that would make you weep. She was all of those things all at once, standing in an emerald green dress that fit her like it had been made for her, which, in a way, it had. She looked beautiful. Not beautiful like a model or a movie star. Beautiful like a woman who has earned every line on her face and every gray hair on her head. Beautiful like the sunrise is beautiful, not because it is perfect, but because it is real. Margaret touched her face gently, as if she were touching something fragile. And then the thing she had been holding inside for 7 years, the thing she had locked away in a place where it could not escape, broke free. She cried. Not quiet, dignified tears, great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body and ruined the makeup that Francesca had spent an hour applying. She cried for David. She cried for the apartment she had almost lost. She cried for the years of eating alone and sleeping alone and carrying everything alone. She cried for the woman she had been before life had worn her down. And she cried for the woman she saw in the mirror, the woman who had survived it all and was still standing. Francesca stood behind her and put her hands on Margaret's shoulders and let her cry. She did not try to stop her. She did not say it was okay. She just stood there, holding her, and waited. When Margaret was done, when the last sob had shuddered out of her body, and she stood there, spent and red-eyed and utterly wrecked, Francesca handed her a tissue and said with perfect calm, "Good. Now I will fix your makeup and we will go. If you are feeling this story the way I think you are, leave a comment right now saying, 'Everyone deserves to be seen.' Let me know if Margaret's journey is touching your heart the way it is touching mine." The Waldorf Astoria on Park Avenue in Manhattan is not just a hotel. It is a monument to wealth and power and the particular kind of American excess that treats luxury as a birthright, rather than a privilege. Its lobby is a cathedral of marble and gold, designed to make every person who walks through its doors feel simultaneously elevated and diminished. Elevated because they are there, diminished because the building itself is so overwhelmingly grand that no human can compete with it. Margaret Holloway walked through those doors at 8:15 on Friday evening, and every head in the lobby turned. She was on Vincent's arm, not in a romantic way, but in the way that old-fashioned gentlemen escort women to events, his hand under her elbow, providing support and direction without presuming ownership. Tommy walked behind them, scanning the room with the automatic vigilance of a man for whom danger was always a professional consideration. Margaret moved slowly, partly because of her hip and partly because she was terrified. The lobby was full of people, men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than Margaret's annual salary, and they were all looking at her. She could feel their eyes, curious and evaluating, and she wanted to shrink into herself to become invisible again, to go back to being the woman nobody saw. But Francesca's voice was in her head. "Stand up straight, shoulders back, chin up. You belong here just as much as anyone." So she stood up straight, shoulders back, chin up. The gala was being held in the grand ballroom, a room so large and so ornate that Margaret almost stopped walking when she saw it. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like inverted galaxies. Round tables draped in white linen filled the floor, each one set with china and silver and crystal glasses that caught the light and scattered it in tiny rainbows. A string quartet played in the corner, and waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd like ghosts, carrying trays of champagne and small bites that looked like works of art. Vincent guided Margaret to their table, near the front of the room. As they walked, people greeted Vincent with the careful warmth reserved for men who are both respected and feared. They shook his hand, kissed his cheek, made small talk about the market and the weather and the upcoming spring benefit season. And then their eyes would slide to Margaret, and the question would form on their faces, always the same question, spoken or unspoken. Who is she? Vincent did not explain. He did not introduce Margaret as his charity project or his good deed or his attempt at redemption. He simply said, "This is Margaret Holloway. She is my guest tonight." And the way he said it, with a quiet authority that left no room for further inquiry, made it clear that was all anyone needed to know. They sat down. The chair felt impossibly soft after years of sitting on hard benches and bus seats, and Margaret fought the irrational urge to check that she was not getting it dirty. She looked around the table at the other guests, a hedge fund manager and his wife, a state senator and her husband, a retired tech executive, who was there alone and who seemed slightly drunk already, and she felt the gulf between their world and hers, yawning open beneath her, like a chasm. "Breathe," Vincent said quietly, leaning toward her. "You are doing fine." "I do not belong here," Margaret whispered. "Neither do I," Vincent said. "I just hide it better." She looked at him, surprised, and he gave her a small smile, and for a moment the chasm felt a little narrower. Dinner was served, 4 courses, each one more elaborate than the last, and Margaret ate slowly, carefully, mimicking the way Vincent used his silverware, and trying not to think about the fact that this single meal probably cost more than her grocery budget for a month. The food was extraordinary, delicate and complex, and presented with an artistry that made her feel like she was eating a painting. But she found that she could not taste much of it. Her nerves had flattened everything. Between courses, people talked. They talked about investments and vacation, homes and children's college acceptances, and the latest production at Lincoln Center. Margaret listened and did not speak, because she had nothing to contribute to these conversations, nothing that would be understood or valued in this world. She was a tourist in the country of the wealthy, and she did not speak the language. And then something changed. The woman sitting to Margaret's right, the state senator's wife, a trim woman in her late 40s with an expertly maintained appearance, and the practiced charm of someone who had attended 1,000 of these events, turned to Margaret and asked, in the polished tone of someone making obligatory conversation, "So, Margaret, what do you do?" It was the question Margaret had been dreading, the question that would expose her, reveal the distance between who she appeared to be tonight and who she actually was. She felt her face heat up, and she opened her mouth to say something evasive, something about being between positions or exploring new opportunities, the kind of vague language that people in this world used when they did not want to admit the truth. But then she stopped, and she thought about Francesca's words. "You have spent your entire life being seen for nothing but who you are." "I am a janitor," Margaret said. "I clean offices in a commercial building in downtown Brooklyn." The senator's wife blinked. There was a moment of silence at the table, the kind of silence that happens when someone says something unexpected in polite company, and Margaret could feel the attention of every person within earshot shift toward her, like a searchlight swinging across a dark field. "A janitor," the senator's wife repeated, and to her credit, her voice contained neither judgment nor pity. It contained something else entirely: curiosity. "Yes," Margaret said. "I clean the 18th through 22nd floors. I have been doing it for 7 years. "And before that?" "Before that, I was a homemaker. My husband and I moved to Brooklyn from West Virginia in 2001. He worked in construction. I stayed home and took care of things. When he passed away in 2017, I needed to find work, and cleaning was what I knew how to do." Margaret was not performing. She was not seeking sympathy or admiration. She was simply telling the truth, in the plain, unembellished way that she had always told the truth, and it had an effect on the people around her that none of them expected. Because in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives curating their images, managing their brands, presenting polished versions of themselves to the world, Margaret's raw honesty was startling. It was like hearing a real instrument after a lifetime of listening to synthesizers. The hedge fund manager's wife leaned forward. 7 years, she said. That must be exhausting. It is hard work, Margaret said, but I take pride in it. When I clean a space, I clean it properly, every surface, every corner. David, my husband, used to say that I could make a pigsty look like a palace. She smiled when she said this, and it was a real smile, the first one she had produced in a very long time, and it transformed her face. The lines around her eyes crinkled, and her hazel eyes, bright against the emerald of her dress, shone with a warmth that was almost luminous. Your husband sounds like he was a good man, the senator's wife said. He was the best man I ever knew, Margaret said. He was kind and funny, and he worked harder than anyone, and he always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. Even when we had nothing, and there were plenty of times when we had nothing, he made me feel rich. And just like that, the conversation changed. It shifted from the performative small talk of wealthy strangers to something genuine, something real. The senator's wife asked about David, and Margaret told stories about him, about how he had proposed by writing, "Marry me, Maggie," in the snow outside her parents' house in West Virginia, about how he had learned to cook Italian food because their first apartment in Brooklyn was above an Italian restaurant, and the smells drove him crazy, about how he had sung to her every morning, badly, because he said that a day that started with a song could not be a bad day. And the people at the table listened. Not out of politeness, not out of obligation. They listened because Margaret Holloway, sitting in a borrowed necklace in a room full of people who had everything, was telling them something they had forgotten. She was telling them what it looked like to build a life out of love rather than ambition. What it felt like to be rich in the only way that mattered. Vincent sat across the table and watched this happen, and he felt something crack open inside him, something he had been holding shut for a very long time. He watched Margaret talk about her husband with a love that was so tangible you could almost touch it, and he thought about Elena at home in their penthouse, and he thought about the last time he had told her he loved her and meant it, really meant it the way Margaret meant it when she talked about David, and he could not remember. He could not remember the last time he had meant anything he said to anyone. The gala continued. Speeches were made, auctions were held, checks were written. A famous singer performed a set that was technically perfect and emotionally empty, and the crowd applauded because that was what crowds at galas did. But through it all, Margaret's table had a different energy. People kept drifting over, drawn by something they could not name, and they would sit down or stand nearby and listen to Margaret talk. And then they would drift away again, looking vaguely unsettled, as if they had heard something important but could not quite figure out what it was. At 10:30, the gala began to wind down. People were gathering their things, making their goodbyes, heading for the exits. Margaret stood up from the table and smoothed her dress and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Not physical exhaustion, though that was there too. Emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 7 years. She was about to tell Vincent she was ready to leave when a woman approached their table. She was in her late 60s, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, with the unmistakable bearing of old money. She walked directly to Margaret and stopped in front of her. "You are Margaret," the woman said. "I am. My name is Eleanor Ashford. I run the Ashford Foundation. We fund workforce development programs for women in underserved communities." She paused. "I have been listening to you all evening. I want to talk to you about a job." Margaret stared at her. "A job? Not cleaning. I mean a real job. We need someone to run our community outreach program in Brooklyn. Someone who understands the neighborhoods, who knows the people, who can connect with the women we are trying to help. Someone who has lived the experience." "I do not have a degree," Margaret said. "I do not have any qualifications." "You have the only qualification that matters," Eleanor said. "You are authentic. You are real. And in a room full of people who spend their lives performing, You were the only person tonight who was not acting. That is worth more than any degree." Margaret looked at Vincent. He was standing a few feet away, watching this exchange with an expression she could not read. He gave her a small nod, barely perceptible. "Can I think about it?" Margaret asked. "Take all the time you need," Eleanor said. She handed Margaret a card. "Call me when you are ready." The days after the gala were the strangest days of Margaret's life. She went back to work on Monday morning, taking the same bus, wearing the same uniform, pushing the same cart through the same hallways. But everything felt different. She felt different, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis and all the familiar things were at a slightly different angle. The emerald dress hung in her closet, returned from the dry cleaner in a garment bag. She looked at it every morning when she got dressed for work, and every morning she thought about the gala, and about Eleanor Ashford's offer, and about what Vincent had said to her in the car on the ride home. The ride home had been quiet. Margaret was tired and full of emotions she could not name, and Vincent seemed to sense that she needed silence, so he gave it to her. They sat in the back of the Mercedes, the city scrolling past the windows, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, as they crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, Margaret said, "Why did you do this?" "Do what?" "All of it. The bills, the rent, the dress, the gala. Why?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know what my mother wanted for me, Margaret? She wanted me to be good. That is all she ever asked. Not rich, not powerful, not successful. Good. And I have spent my entire life doing everything except that." He turned to look at her. "When I saw you in that alley, hurt and alone and too proud to accept help, I saw my mother. I saw every woman like my mother, every woman who carries the world on her shoulders and never asks for anything in return. And I thought, for once in my life, I am going to do the right thing, not because it benefits me, not because it gives me leverage, not because it makes me look good, but because it is right." Margaret studied his face in the dim light of the car. "You are not a good man, are you, Vincent?" It was not an accusation. It was a question, asked with the gentle directness of someone who has spent her entire life looking at people honestly. Vincent almost smiled. "No," he said, "I am not. I have done things, Margaret. Things that would make you walk away from me and never look back if you knew about them. I have built my life on a foundation that my mother would not recognize, and I have told myself for 30 years that it was necessary, that it was the only way, that the world gave me no choice. But the truth is, we always have a choice. I just kept making the wrong one." "So what is this?" Margaret asked. "Is this your redemption?" "I do not believe in redemption," Vincent said. "Not the kind they talk about in church, where you say a prayer and everything is forgiven. What I have done cannot be undone by writing checks or buying dresses. But I believe in doing something right. Even if it is only one thing, even if it is only one time, I believe that matters." Margaret nodded. She understood, not because she approved of who Vincent was or what he had done, but because she understood the weight of regret, the desperate desire to make something right in a life that has gone wrong, and the painful knowledge that some things can never be fully repaired. "Your mother would be proud of tonight," Margaret said. Vincent's jaw tightened, and for a moment, just a moment, Margaret saw something in his eyes that she recognized. The same thing she had seen in her own eyes in the mirror every morning for 7 years. Loss, grief, the specific pain of missing someone so much that it has become part of your anatomy, as fundamental as a heartbeat. "I hope so," he said, and that was all. In the days that followed, Margaret discovered that Vincent had been true to his word about everything. The medical bills were paid, all $12,004. $100 gone, zeroed out, as if they had never existed. Her back rent was paid, and her landlord, a perpetually irritated man named Kowalski, who had never shown her a moment of kindness in 23 years of tenancy, had actually called her to tell her, in a voice that sounded both confused and slightly awed, that her account was current and that she should not worry about anything for a while. She had health insurance now. Real health insurance. Not the bare minimum plan she had been on through her employer, which covered practically nothing, but a comprehensive plan that meant she could see a doctor when she needed to, get her medications without rationing, and stop worrying that every twinge of pain or irregular heartbeat was a financial catastrophe waiting to happen. And she had Eleanor Ashford's business card sitting on her kitchen table next to the salt shaker, waiting. She picked it up and put it down approximately 40 times over the course of the week. She turned it over in her hands and read the embossed text, and imagined herself calling the number, and imagined what she would say, and then imagined all the ways it could go wrong. She did not have a degree. She did not have management experience. She did not have any of the credentials that people in Eleanor's world considered essential for the kind of job Eleanor was offering. But she had something else. She had 23 years of living in Brooklyn. She had 7 years of cleaning buildings, and riding buses and shopping at bodegas and sitting in laundromats. She knew the neighborhoods. She knew the women Eleanor was trying to help, because she was one of them. She knew what they needed, not in the abstract, theoretical way that people with degrees knew things, but in the concrete, bone-deep way that comes from living it. On Thursday, 8 days after the gala, Margaret called Eleanor Ashford. "I have been thinking about your offer," she said. And I have some questions. I would be disappointed if you did not." They met for lunch the next day at a restaurant in Park Slope that was casual enough to make Margaret comfortable and expensive enough to make her realize that Eleanor's definition of casual and her own were very different things. Eleanor walked her through the details of the job. Community outreach coordinator for the Ashford Foundation's Brooklyn division. The job involved going into neighborhoods, meeting with women who were struggling, connecting them with resources, job training, housing assistance, legal help, healthcare. It meant being a bridge between the women who needed help and the institutions that could provide it. "Why me?" Margaret asked. "You could hire someone with experience, someone with connections." "I could," Eleanor agreed. "And I have tried. Do you know what happens? They last 6 months, maybe a year, and then they burn out or move on to something more prestigious, because they do not understand the women they are supposed to be helping. They see them as clients, as cases, as statistics. They do not see them as people." She leaned forward. "Margaret, I watched you at that gala. I watched a room full of the most important people in New York City stop what they were doing and listen to you. Not because of what you were wearing or who you were with, because of who you are. You have a gift. You make people feel seen. You make people feel heard. And that is exactly what the women in our program need. Someone who sees them. Someone who hears them. Someone who has walked in their shoes and come out the other side." Margaret thought about this. She thought about the bus stop on Church Avenue and the bathroom floor where she had fallen and the eviction notice on her kitchen table. She thought about David and about what he would say if he were here. She knew exactly what he would say. He would say, "Rise and shine, Maggie. The world needs you today." "I want to try," Margaret said. "I do not know if I can do it, but I want to try." "That is all I am asking," Eleanor said. Margaret gave her notice at the cleaning company the following Monday. Patricia, her supervisor, took the news with characteristic pragmatism. "Good for you," she said. "You deserved better than this place." Margaret was surprised. In 7 years, Patricia had never said anything remotely personal to her. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me. Just do not forget about us when you are out there changing the world. We are still going to need someone to clean the 18th floor." Margaret laughed. It was a real laugh, full and warm, and it echoed in the hallway of the building she had cleaned for 7 years, and it sounded like the beginning of something. She started at the Ashford Foundation on the 1st of March. Her office was in a converted brownstone in Fort Greene, a neighborhood she knew well because she used to clean a lawyer's office there on weekends for extra money. The office was small but bright, with tall windows that let in the kind of natural light that makes everything feel possible, and Margaret sat at her desk on her first morning and looked around and felt a mixture of terror and excitement that was almost identical to what she had felt walking into the Waldorf. She was not qualified for this job, she knew that. Everyone knew that. But Eleanor had made it clear that Margaret's qualifications were not going to be measured in degrees or certifications. They were going to be measured in connections made, in women helped, in lives changed. And Margaret knew how to do that. She had been doing it her whole life without knowing it. Every conversation at the bus stop, every kind word to a tired co-worker, every meal shared with a neighbor who was going through a hard time. She had been doing outreach for 53 years. She just had not called it that. Her first case was a woman named Yolanda, 38 years old, 3 children, living in a shelter in Bed-Stuy after leaving. A dangerous domestic situation. Margaret went to see her on a Tuesday morning, carrying a folder of paperwork and a bag of groceries, because Francesca had told her that you never visit someone empty-handed, and Margaret had taken that advice to heart. Yolanda was wary. She had been through the system, seen the social workers and the case managers and the well-meaning volunteers, and she had learned to be suspicious of anyone who showed up promising help. She sat in the common room of the shelter with her arms crossed and her eyes flat, and waited for Margaret to give her the speech about resources and opportunities and pulling yourself up, the speech that people who had never been down always seemed to have memorized. Margaret did not give the speech. Instead, she sat down across from Yolanda and said, "I was almost homeless 2 months ago. My landlord was evicting me. I had no money, no family, nothing. I cleaned bathrooms for a living, and I could not even afford my blood pressure medication." Yolanda's expression shifted just slightly. A crack in the armor. "For real?" she said. "For real. And the only reason I am sitting here instead of in a shelter like this one is because somebody saw me and decided to help. Not because I deserved it more than anyone else. Not because I was special, just because they saw me." She leaned forward. "I see you, Yolanda. I see your children. And I am not here to give you a speech. I am here to sit with you and figure out what you need and then help you get it. One step at a time, no speeches, no deadlines, just one step at a time." Yolanda looked at Margaret for a long moment, and then, slowly, she uncrossed her arms. "Okay," she said. "Let us talk." Over the next months, Margaret threw herself into her work with an energy that surprised everyone, including herself. She went into neighborhoods most of the Foundation's previous outreach workers had been afraid to visit. She knocked on doors, sat on stoops, rode buses, stood in lines at food banks and housing offices, and she talked to women, dozens of them, hundreds of them. Women who had been forgotten by the system, ignored by the institutions that were supposed to help them, written off by a society that had no use for them. And she listened. That was the thing that set Margaret apart from every outreach worker who had come before her. She did not have answers. She did not have solutions. She did not have a 5-step plan for turning your life around. What she had was the ability to sit with someone and listen, really listen, without judgment, without agenda, without the subconscious impatience of someone who is already thinking about the next case on their list. She heard stories that broke her heart. Women who had been through things Margaret could barely imagine, who had survived circumstances that would have destroyed most people, and who were still standing, still fighting, still trying to build something out of nothing. And she helped them. Not with grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but with the small, steady, relentless work of connecting people to the things they needed. A job training program here, a legal clinic there, a daycare arrangement, a doctor who accepted their insurance, a landlord who was willing to give them a chance. She was good at it. She was very, very good at it. And word got around. Within 3 months, Margaret's caseload had tripled. Within 6 months, the Foundation's Brooklyn Outreach program had more active clients than any other division. Eleanor was delighted. The board was impressed. And Margaret, for the first time in 7 years, felt like she was doing something that mattered. She still saw Vincent from time to time, not often, and never in a way that attracted attention. He would send Tommy to check on her every few weeks, and occasionally Margaret would find an envelope in her mailbox with a note that said simply, "Thinking of you, V." There was never money in the envelope. Vincent understood that the money part was done, that what Margaret needed from him now was not financial support, but something quieter. Acknowledgement. The simple knowledge that someone out there knew her story and cared about how it continued. They met for coffee once about 4 months after the gala, at the same diner on Flatbush where they had first talked. Vincent looked older, Margaret thought. Tired. There were lines around his eyes that she did not remember, and a heaviness too, his movements that suggested he was carrying something new. "How is the job?" he asked. "It is the best thing I have ever done," Margaret said. "I did not know I had this in me, Vincent. All those years, cleaning floors, being invisible, I thought that was all I was, all I could be, and it turns out I was wrong." "You were never invisible to me," Vincent said. "I know, and that changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their coffee, and then Margaret asked, "How are you, Vincent? Really?" He was quiet for a long time. "I am making some changes," he said finally. "In my business, in my life. Changes that are long overdue, and that are not going to be easy." "What kind of changes?" "The kind my mother would have wanted." He did not elaborate, and Margaret did not press. She understood that there were parts of Vincent's life that she could not know about, and that his journey, whatever it looked like, was his own to walk. "Be careful," she said. "I will try." "Your mother would be proud," Margaret said again, as she had in the car that night. "I hope so," he said again. And Margaret saw the same grief in his eyes, the same loss. But there was something else there too now, something that looked a little like resolve. A year later, Margaret Holloway stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria and looked out at a sea of faces. She was wearing the emerald dress. Francesca had insisted on it, even though Margaret had protested, that she could not wear the same dress twice, and Francesca had told her, in her no-nonsense Milanese way, that the dress was part of the story now, and the story was not over. She was there to accept an award. The Ashford Foundation's Community Service Award, given annually to the person who had done the most to advance the Foundation's mission. Eleanor had nominated her, and the board had approved unanimously, and now Margaret was standing at a podium with a crystal trophy in her hands and a ballroom full of people waiting for her to speak. She had written a speech, 3 pages, double-spaced, carefully prepared with help from a young intern at the Foundation named James, who had a degree in communications and who had taught Margaret how to structure her thoughts for public speaking. The speech was in her pocket, folded neatly, and she had practiced it 15 times in front of her bathroom mirror. She did not use it. Instead, she stood at the podium and looked at the faces in front of her, the donors and the board members and the politicians and the socialites, and she thought about all the faces she had seen over the past year. Yolanda, who now had a job and an apartment, and whose children were in school. Maria, who had gotten her GED and was applying to nursing programs. Denise, who had left her dangerous situation for good and was rebuilding her life in a new neighborhood. Dozens of others, hundreds of others, women whose names would never be known in rooms like this, but whose courage was greater than anything Margaret had ever witnessed. "1 year ago," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I was cleaning bathrooms. That was my job. I cleaned bathrooms and offices and hallways in a building in downtown Brooklyn, and I'd been doing it for 7 years, and I thought that was all I would ever do." She paused. The room was silent. I was invisible. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that anyone did on purpose. I was invisible in the way that a lot of women become invisible when they reach a certain age and a certain income level and a certain point in their lives where society decides they no longer matter. People looked at me and they did not see me. They saw a uniform. They saw a mop. They saw someone who was there to clean up after them and then disappear. She took a breath. And then someone saw me. A man named Vincent Moretti looked at me in an alley behind the building I cleaned, on a day when I was hurt and alone and losing everything. And he saw me. He did not see a janitor, he did not see a charity case, he saw a woman. A whole complicated real woman with a story and a history and a value that had nothing to do with her job or her bank account. He helped me. He helped me in ways that were practical, yes, paying bills, finding insurance, making sure I did not lose my home. But he also helped me in a way that was more important than any of that. He showed me that I was worth seeing, that my story mattered, that I had something to give even when I had nothing left. She looked down at the trophy in her hands. It was heavy, heavier than she expected, and the crystal caught the light from the chandeliers and broke it into tiny rainbows, just like the glasses at the table where she had sat a year ago. "I'm standing here tonight not because I am special," she said. "I'm standing here because someone gave me a chance. And for the past year, that is what I have been trying to do for the women I work with. Not change their lives, not fix their problems, just see them, just let them know that they are worth seeing." She paused again. She could feel the tears coming, but this time she did not fight them. She let them come, and she let them fall, and she did not apologize for them. "David, my husband, used to say something to me every morning. He would say, 'Rise and shine, Maggie. The world needs you today.' For 7 years after he died, I did not believe that. I thought the world had forgotten about me. I thought I was invisible." She looked up. She looked at the faces in front of her, and she saw something in them that she recognized. She saw the same thing she saw in the faces of the women she worked with every day. The desire to be seen, the need to know that you matter, the universal, aching, human longing to be told that you are not invisible. "The world needs you," she said, "every single one of you. Not the version of you that you show to rooms like this. Not the polished, perfect, curated version. The real you. The messy, complicated, imperfect, beautiful, struggling, surviving, fighting real you. The world needs that person, and that person deserves to be seen." The room was silent for a long moment, and then the applause started. It started small, a few hands clapping somewhere in the back, and then it grew, building on itself like a wave, until the entire ballroom was on its feet, 500 people standing and clapping, and some of them wiping their eyes, and Margaret stood at the podium and felt the sound wash over her, and thought about David, and thought about Vincent, and thought about the girl from West Virginia who had come to Brooklyn with nothing but a suitcase and a husband's hand to hold. Vincent was not there that night. He had sent a message through Tommy explaining that he could not attend, that there were things happening in his life that required his attention, and that it was better for Margaret if he kept his distance for a while. Margaret understood. She did not ask questions. She simply sent a message back through Tommy that said, "Thank you for everything." What Margaret did not know, what she would not learn until much later, was that Vincent Moretti was in the process of dismantling parts of his empire. Not all of it, he was too deep for that, but the parts that kept him up at night, the parts that his mother would have wept over if she had known. He was cooperating, quietly and selectively, with people who had been trying to get his cooperation for years, and he was doing it not for immunity or a reduced sentence, but because he had made a decision that his daughter Sophia had been right all along, that there were better ways to use power than the ways he had been using it. It was going to cost him. He knew that. It was going to cost him relationships, money, possibly his freedom. But he had watched Margaret stand up at a diner table and tell the truth about who she was, and he had watched her walk into a room full of people who should have intimidated her and instead captivated them with nothing but her honesty. And he had realized something. Courage was not about being unafraid. Courage was about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. He thought about his mother. He thought about Margaret. And he picked up the phone. Margaret continued her work at the Ashford Foundation. She expanded the Brooklyn program, hired 2 assistants, and developed a training curriculum based on her own experience that became a model for outreach programs in other cities. She became a speaker, not a professional one, just a woman who stood up at community events and school assemblies and church meetings and told her story, the same way she had told it at the gala, plainly and honestly and without embellishment. She kept the emerald dress. She wore it every year at the Foundation's annual gala, and every year Francesca came to her apartment and helped her get ready, and every year they shared a moment in front of the bathroom mirror, where they both acknowledged, without words, the distance Margaret had traveled from the woman who had stood in the same spot a year before, and cried. She thought about David every day. She talked to him sometimes, standing at the kitchen window of her apartment, looking out at the street below, telling him about her work and her clients and the small victories and the heartbreaking losses. She told him about Yolanda and Maria and Denise. She told him about Eleanor and Francesca and Tommy. She told him about Vincent, about the strange, complicated, deeply flawed man who had seen her in an alley and decided to change both their lives. And she imagined what David would say. She imagined his crooked smile and his warm voice and his absolute certainty that the world was a good place, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. "Rise and shine, Maggie," she imagined him saying. "The world needs you today." And every morning she believed it. The Mafia. Boss helped a poor woman. Her new look with a luxury dress left everyone speechless. But that was never really the story. The dress was beautiful, yes. The transformation was remarkable, yes. The gala was unforgettable, yes. But the real story was simpler than all of that. The real story was about seeing, about one person looking at another person and saying, "I see you, you matter, you are not invisible." That is the most powerful thing any human being can do for another. It costs nothing. It requires nothing except the willingness to look, really look, at the person in front of you and acknowledge their existence, their struggle, their value. Margaret Holloway spent 7 years being invisible, and then she was seen, and everything changed, not because of a dress, not because of money, not because of a powerful man who decided to play hero for a day, because someone looked at her and recognized something that should have been obvious all along, that she was a human being, that she had a story worth telling, that she deserved to be seen. We all do, every single one of us. If you watch this until the very end, it is because this story touched something inside you. And if it did, then you already know what I am going to say. We all have a Margaret in our lives, someone who is carrying more than they should, someone who has made themselves invisible because they think nobody cares, someone who is one act of kindness away from remembering who they really are. See them. There's all. Just see them. If you are still here, if you watch this entire story, then you are the kind of person who cares. You are the kind of person who believes that stories like this matter, that people like Margaret matter, that the small acts of kindness and recognition that hold this world together matter. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you never miss a story that moves you, challenges you, and reminds you of what it means to be human. If you watched this far, leave a comment saying "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and see who really connects with the stories on this channel. Hit the like button if Margaret's story made you feel something real, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who might be feeling invisible, someone who might need to know that they are seen, because that is what stories are for. They remind us that we are not alone, that our struggles are shared, that our pain is witnessed, that our lives matter even when the world tells us they do not. Rise and shine. The world needs you today.